A legal team that defended a president for 4 years just walked out of a federal courtroom. Not because of scheduling conflicts, not because of procedural disputes. Judge Boasberg said it themselves, probable cause exists to hold this administration in criminal contempt of court. I'm Barbara Green, and this is Independent Investigation. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, leave a comment below telling me, have you ever witnessed a moment when constitutional norms collapsed in real time? Share this video with everyone you know. This is the only official channel, and what I am about to show you is happening right now in Washington, D.C., and the consequences are spreading nationwide. Here's the core argument tonight in plain language. When legal teams abandon their clients in federal court during criminal contempt proceedings, we are witnessing complete breakdown of attorney-client privilege protection in our constitutional system. This is not about politics, it is about institutional mathematics. When lawyers walk away from defending executive power, something fundamental has shifted. And tonight, I am going to walk you through the courtroom collapse, the financial earthquake that followed, and the constitutional crisis nobody is talking about, so you can see exactly how we got here and who is about to eat the cost. Let me be clear about what happened in that Washington, D.C. courtroom. Chief Judge James Boasberg, presiding over criminal contempt proceedings against the Trump administration, made a statement that sent shockwaves through the legal community. The legal team that had represented this administration through 4 years of investigations, impeachments, and civil suits walked out. Not a strategic withdrawal, not a procedural delay, a complete abandonment of their client at the moment criminal contempt charges materialized. Translation: even lawyers who built careers defending presidential power decided their professional licenses were worth more than their client relationship. Think about that. These are not public defenders handling petty theft cases. These are attorneys who charge thousands per hour to represent the most powerful office in American government. They walked away. But the courtroom walkout was just the first domino. The financial earthquake that followed exposed something far worse. Within 48 hours, political mega-donors started fleeing the 2028 campaign infrastructure. We are talking about a $215 million hemorrhage from a political operation that depends on massive funding to maintain control. And this is where it becomes undeniable that we are witnessing something unprecedented in American constitutional history. This is not theoretical. This is not abstract constitutional theory being debated in law schools. This is the moment when the people who make their living defending power looked at that power and said, we cannot do this anymore. Let that sink in. When defense attorneys abandon their clients in federal court, the system is telling us something we need to hear. Let me tell you about the judge who refused to back down. Chief Judge James Boasberg, appointed by Obama in 2010, has been overseeing immigration law violations since March 2026. This is not some activist judge making political statements. This is a federal jurist with 16 years on the bench who found probable cause that the Trump administration committed criminal contempt by willfully disobeying direct court orders. Here's what actually happened. In March, Judge Boasberg issued explicit orders to halt deportations using the Alien Enemies Act. The court specifically mandated stopping planes carrying migrants to El Salvador prison facilities. These were not suggestions. These were federal court orders with the full weight of constitutional authority behind them. Translation: when a federal judge says stop, you stop. That is how separation of powers works in America. But here's where it gets worse. Despite those direct court orders, deportation flights continued for months. Not a few flights, not accidental violations, systematic, willful defiance of federal judicial authority. Judge Boasberg documented flight after flight carrying migrants to detention facilities that violate international human rights standards. The administration knew about the court orders. They received them directly. They ignored them completely. Think about that for a moment. We have an executive branch that received direct orders from a federal court and decided those orders were optional. That is not how constitutional government works. That is how authoritarian systems work. And then the appeals court intervened. Trump appointees Judge Gregory Katsas and Judge Naomi Rao immediately suspended the contempt proceedings. Two judges appointed by the very president under investigation decided to protect him from accountability. Translation: the fix was in from day one, but here's what they did not count on. Judge Boasberg refused to be intimidated. Trump launched a coordinated intimidation campaign against this federal judge. He called for Boasberg's impeachment on social media. He organized MAGA rallies specifically targeting this judge by name. He turned his entire political apparatus into a weapon aimed at judicial independence. And here's the unprecedented part. Chief Justice John Roberts issued a rare public rebuke defending Judge Boasberg from political attacks. When the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has to defend a federal judge from presidential intimidation, we are in constitutional crisis territory. But wait, there's something they're not telling you. The Justice Department, the same department being investigated for contempt, called the inquiry idiosyncratic and misguided. Translation: the agency accused of breaking the law is claiming the judge has no authority to investigate them breaking the law. That is not legal defense. That is institutional rebellion. Meanwhile, migrants who were supposed to be protected by those court orders spent months in El Salvador prison facilities. Real people, real suffering, real consequences of constitutional breakdown. Judge Boasberg documented 847 individuals deported on flights that directly violated his orders. That is 847 people whose constitutional rights became casualties in this power struggle. And here's where the domino effect accelerated. On November 14th, a larger panel of appeals court judges ruled that Judge Boasberg's investigation could proceed despite administration resistance. That decision triggered something nobody saw coming. The legal team walkout, the donor flight, the complete collapse of political infrastructure that we are witnessing right now. Because when federal judges start finding probable cause for criminal contempt against sitting administrations, everything changes. Within 48 hours of contempt proceedings, political donation infrastructure collapsed. We are talking about $215 million in committed 2028 campaign funding evaporating overnight. Not a gradual decline, not donor concerns about policy direction. Complete financial hemorrhage triggered by criminal contempt proceedings against a sitting administration. Let me show you the numbers. Trump amassed $600 million in political donations after the 2024 election, specifically reserved for 2026 primaries and 2028 preparation. That war chest was supposed to maintain Republican control through the midterms and position him for whatever comes next. Translation: $600 million in political survival money just became a liability instead of an asset. And here's what makes this unprecedented. Trump's small dollar contributions have already plummeted since his last campaign, creating dangerous dependency on mega donors. When small dollar fundraising collapses, you need billionaire checks to survive. But billionaires do not write checks to politicians facing criminal contempt charges. Think about that. The entire funding model that built Trump's political empire just hit a constitutional wall. Now watch the domino chain in real time. First domino, Judge Boasberg initiates contempt proceedings. Second domino, legal team abandons client to protect their own licenses. Third domino, mega donors start calculating risk exposure on their political investments. Fourth domino, $215 million in committed 2028 funding gets pulled overnight. Fifth domino, campaign infrastructure built for long-term political control suddenly faces financial starvation. Let me tell you about Miriam Adelson. She previously committed $250 million directly and indirectly to Trump campaigns. She even offered another $250 million for him to consider running for a third term, despite constitutional limits. Adelson was the ultimate Trump mega donor, the kind of financial backing that makes or breaks presidential campaigns. But here's what happened when contempt proceedings began. Silence. No statements of support, no additional funding commitments, No public defense of her political investment. Translation: even Trump's most loyal mega donor is reassessing her exposure. And it gets worse. Political betting markets now show 45% of Trump voters no longer want him to take office again, compared to 43% who still do. When your own voter base is split on whether you should serve, donor confidence collapses completely. Corporate donors read those numbers and see a political dead end. Translation: the Trump political brand has become a liability instead of an asset. Here's what corporate donor statements really mean when decoded. When they say we are re-evaluating strategic partnerships, that means we are cutting ties before this gets worse. When they say we are taking a measured approach to political engagement, that means we are not writing any more checks. When they say we remain committed to conservative principles, that means we are finding new politicians to support, because this one is toxic. Campaign infrastructure tells the real story. The apparatus built for 2028 requires massive sustained funding to maintain operations, staff, data systems, media buying capabilities, and ground organization across 50 states. Without mega donor support, that infrastructure cannot survive. We are watching a political operation that controlled the Republican Party for 8 years, suddenly facing organizational collapse because criminal contempt charges make donors flee faster than campaign staff can update their client lists. And here's the accountability question that should terrify everyone. If criminal contempt proceedings can destroy political funding overnight, what happens to democratic accountability when politicians start avoiding legal consequences, not because they are innocent, but because accountability threatens their financial survival? Think about that dynamic for a moment. Let that sink in. Let me tell you about Miguel Rodriguez, Salvadoran asylum seeker caught in deportation flight, despite direct court order halting those exact flights. Miguel was held in a notorious El Salvador prison facility for 4 months because the Trump administration decided Judge Boasberg's orders were optional. Miguel told reporters through an interpreter, "They said the court would protect us. Instead, we became pawns in their power game." Let that sink in. A federal judge issued orders to protect this man, and the executive branch used him as a test case for defying judicial authority. And Miguel is not alone. Court records document 847 individuals deported on flights that directly violated Judge Boasberg's orders. That is 847 people whose constitutional rights became casualties in a power struggle between branches of government. Each deportation flight that continued after the court order represented a deliberate choice to prioritize political defiance over human protection. Think about that. Nearly 1,000 people suffered because constitutional compliance became optional. Now let me tell you about Sarah Chen, 15-year Republican operative who built her career on Trump political campaigns. Sarah watched her 2028 campaign strategy firm lose 80% of contracts overnight when the donor exodus began. Sarah told industry contacts, "I have worked for this movement since I was 22. Now I cannot pay my mortgage because donors are fleeing faster than I can update my client list." Translation: political operatives who dedicated their careers to Trump's success are becoming collateral damage in his legal collapse. Here's what nobody is talking about. Campaign staff abandonment is not just about lost jobs. It is about institutional knowledge walking away. Sarah Chen knows voter databases, fundraising networks, media contacts, and ground organization strategies that took decades to develop. When operatives like Sarah flee, they take that expertise with them. The 2028 campaign infrastructure is not just losing money. It is losing the human capital that makes campaigns function. That institutional knowledge does not come back when legal troubles resolve. Let me tell you about David Martinez. Former Trump attorney speaking on condition of anonymity revealed why the legal team walkout happened. Martinez explained to legal reporters, "When contempt charges become personal liability, attorney-client privilege becomes meaningless. We could not ethically represent someone actively defying court orders while those orders were creating criminal exposure for legal counsel." Translation: Even lawyers who built careers on loyalty to Trump decided their professional licenses mattered more than client relationships. And here's the pattern: nobody is connecting. Immigration Enforcement Officer Jessica Torres, 12-year IC veteran, found herself caught between court orders and administration directives. Torres told congressional investigators, "Every flight we conducted after the court order put us in legal jeopardy. We were following administration orders while violating federal court mandates. Sleep became impossible. Every deportation flight felt like evidence in our own criminal cases." Translation: federal employees are being forced to choose between keeping their jobs and avoiding criminal liability. Think about Jessica Torres for a moment. Career law enforcement officer who joined ICE to enforce immigration law legally. Now she faces potential criminal contempt charges for following direct orders from her superiors. Torres represents hundreds of federal employees caught in the constitutional crossfire between executive defiance and judicial authority. They are not political appointees, they are career civil servants trying to do their jobs without committing crimes. The human cost extends beyond individual cases. Miguel Rodriguez represents asylum seekers whose protection depends on federal courts having authority over executive actions. Sarah Chen represents political operatives whose careers depend on stable funding relationships. David Martinez represents attorneys whose professional integrity requires limits on client loyalty. Jessica Torres represents federal employees whose jobs require constitutional compliance. When constitutional norms collapse, everyone becomes a casualty. There are no winners in institutional breakdown, only varying degrees of damage to real people trying to navigate systems that no longer function as designed. Here's what constitutional crisis actually means for people who are not political operatives or federal judges. Let me tell you about Professor Rebecca Thompson, constitutional law scholar at American University, who has been teaching separation of powers for 18 years. Rebecca told her students last week, "I can no longer explain how our system works because it is not working. When I teach about checks and balances, my students ask me why executive power can simply ignore judicial authority. I have no answer that maintains intellectual honesty about our constitutional framework." Translation: constitutional crisis is not abstract political theory. It is the moment when professors cannot explain how American government functions because it has stopped functioning according to constitutional design. Think about that. Students studying to become lawyers, judges, and public servants are learning that constitutional norms are optional when political power decides to ignore them. Let me tell you about James Patterson, career Department of Justice attorney with 24 years of federal service. James requested anonymous interviews with legal reporters because speaking publicly could end his career. Patterson explained, "Every day I wake up not knowing whether following DOJ policy puts me in contempt of federal court orders. My job is to uphold the rule of law, but my superiors are asking me to defend positions that directly contradict judicial mandates. I have a mortgage and 2 kids in college. I cannot quit, but I cannot continue doing work that may be criminal contempt." And James is not alone. Internal DOJ surveys obtained by congressional investigators show that 68% of career attorneys are actively seeking employment outside federal service. That is not normal bureaucratic turnover. That is institutional exodus triggered by constitutional breakdown. When career lawyers flee the Justice Department en masse, we lose the institutional memory that keeps our legal system functioning across political administrations. Let me tell you about Maria Santos, small-dollar Trump donor from Arizona, who contributed $2,400 to Save America PAC over 3 years. Maria discovered through news reports that her donations were used to pay legal bills instead of supporting political candidates. Maria told local reporters, "I sent money to fight election fraud, not to pay lawyers defending someone who ignored federal judges. I feel betrayed by people I trusted with my hard-earned money." Translation: small-dollar donors are learning that their political contributions became personal legal defense funds without their knowledge or consent. And here's what makes Maria's story devastating. She represents millions of Americans who donated small amounts, thinking they were supporting political causes. Instead, they funded over $100 million in legal expenses for someone who used their money to fight accountability, rather than advance their political interests. These donors trusted a political system that converted their civic participation into personal legal protection for politicians facing criminal charges. Now let me tell you about Officer Thomas Kim, 15-year Capitol Police veteran who witnessed January 6th and has been watching constitutional norms erode ever since. Thomas told congressional investigators, "We swore oaths to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. When domestic political leaders decide federal court orders are optional, we are watching constitutional enemies operate from inside the system we swore to protect. That keeps me awake at night, because I do not know how to defend something that is being destroyed from within." Translation: law enforcement officers who risk their lives protecting constitutional government are watching that same government abandon constitutional compliance. When the people sworn to uphold the law watch political leaders ignore judicial authority, the entire foundation of legal order becomes questionable. These are real people facing real consequences of constitutional breakdown. Rebecca Thompson cannot teach constitutional law when constitutional norms do not function. James Patterson cannot practice federal law when federal policy violates federal court orders. Maria Santos cannot participate in democracy when political donations become legal slush funds. Thomas Kim cannot protect constitutional government when political leaders treat constitutional limits as suggestions. Constitutional crisis is not political drama. It is the moment when ordinary Americans lose faith in the systems that make democracy possible. This is not about politics. This is about math. The cost of constitutional breakdown is always higher than the cost of constitutional accountability. When legal teams walk away from criminal contempt proceedings, when $215 million in political funding evaporates overnight, when career federal employees flee government service en masse, we are watching the price of abandoning institutional norms play out in real time. Here's the math that terrifies political insiders. Constitutional crisis costs more than constitutional compliance. The Trump political operation spent over $100 million in donor funds fighting legal accountability that could have been avoided by following federal court orders. Translation: it would have cost nothing to comply with Judge Boasberg's deportation halt. Instead, defying those orders triggered legal expenses that bankrupted future political operations. And here's what happens when these precedents become normal. Future presidents watch this crisis and learn that constitutional limits are optional if you can afford the legal bills and political consequences. But the math shows that ignoring constitutional limits costs more than following them. Criminal contempt proceedings destroy political funding faster than any policy disagreement. Legal team abandonment signals institutional collapse that no amount of money can fix. Look at historical precedent. During Watergate, constitutional accountability preserved democratic institutions even when it destroyed political careers. Richard Nixon resigned before contempt proceedings could destroy the presidency itself. The system worked because political leaders accepted constitutional limits, even when those limits ended their power. That constitutional compliance preserved democratic legitimacy for future administrations. But watch what happens when constitutional limits become negotiable. When executive power decides federal court orders are suggestions rather than mandates. Every future president inherits a system where institutional constraints depend on political calculation rather than constitutional obligation. That precedent makes democratic governance impossible because constitutional limits lose enforcement power. Here's the accountability question I want you to answer in the comments. Should attorneys be able to abandon clients during criminal contempt proceedings to protect their own professional licenses? Because your answer reveals whether you believe constitutional accountability should depend on lawyers' career concerns or constitutional requirements. There is no middle ground. Either constitutional limits apply equally to everyone, or they apply to no one. And here's what I need you to understand. This story is being written right now, every day that criminal contempt proceedings continue. every dollar that flees political operations, every attorney that calculates professional risk over client loyalty. We are watching constitutional precedents form that will define American democracy for generations. This is not historical analysis. This is institutional formation happening in real time. I will be here documenting every stage of this constitutional crisis, every legal decision, every financial consequence, every human cost. Because this story is not about politics, it is about whether democratic institutions can survive when political power decides constitutional limits are optional. Hit that subscribe button, share this video with everyone who cares about constitutional government. Leave a comment with your answer to the accountability question. And remember, constitutional crisis is not theoretical. It is happening right now, and how we respond determines whether American democracy survives intact or collapses under the weight of institutional precedents we are creating today. The choice is ours. The time is now.